Good afternoon. Welcome to session 2 of the 2026 Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Forum. We're glad you're here. Our first speaker in the second session is Tim Tanner. He is a nationally recognized author, artist, educator, and historic preservationist. He's an avid historian, has been for over 50 years. His writings have been included in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Muzzleloader Magazine, Old House Journal, and Early Homes Magazine. So his topic is Beyond Alfred Jacob Miller, an Artist's Perspective. Take it away, Tim.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. This is kind of nice performing in the dark, so I don't have to see you and you don't have to see me. I'm going to start out with a question for you here in just a second, but before I get to that question, obviously the title of my article this year is Beyond Alfred Jacob Miller, One Artist's Perspective. That One Artist's Perspective title is a little bit of a double entendre. I happen to be an artist, is what I do for a living. So this is a little bit about my perspective as an artist, but it's also about Alfred Jacob Miller being one artist. So here's my first question for you. Let's see. Oh, I got to turn this on. Okay. Here's my first question for you. I want you to imagine for just a minute a library full of books about fur trade history. Okay. Our dear friend Jim has probably one of the best libraries I've ever seen, and Jim just Jim just moved his library from one residence to another. Jim, do you have any idea how many books you have? Yeah, he's got, it's got to be in the thousands. I don't know what it is. Imagine all of the books that have ever been written about the fur trade history. And I want you to imagine for just a second what that would be like if suddenly we could only have one of them. How much information all of those other books have that we wouldn't know. Even the best book, if you could pick one book, and there are some awesome books out there, but if you could only have one book, you can imagine all of that information we wouldn't know. Well, to some degree, because Alfred Jacob Miller was the only artist to come to a rendezvous, we're in that situation where we only have one book instead of hundreds of books. And fortunately, he captured a lot, and we rely on Alfred Jacob Miller a huge amount. Now, some of you, when I mention Alfred Jacob Miller, you're going to know him like the back of your hand. Others, this might be the first time you've heard that name. But basically, Alfred Jacob Miller was an artist. He was originally from the Baltimore area. He was professionally trained in Europe and came back and set up shop. He happened to be in St. Louis in the around 1835, 1836, and was hired by a Scottish nobleman, William Drummond Stewart, who had been to a couple of rendezvous already, had been to the mountains. And William Drummond Stewart hired Alfred Jacob Miller to come out and record his trip. So in 1837 is when Alfred Jacob Miller came out and recorded a rendezvous. So he was there for the trip out to the mountains. Of course, he painted a lot of the events of the rendezvous, and then he was there for the trip back. I don't remember the exact dates that he left, It's in my article, to be honest with you. But it was approximately from around, I want to say, April-ish or so, March, April is when his trip started, and he was back by October-ish, back in St. Louis. He mostly did sketches and stuff while he was at the rendezvous. But for years and years later, he did paintings from those sketches and from memory, of course. Many of the paintings were done for William Drummond Stewart, who hired him in the first place. But later on, he got to be fairly well known and was doing paintings for other, folks as well. A lot of his work was commissioned, not all of it, but a lot of it was commissioned. So anyway, that's who Alfred Jacob Miller is. There's books and websites and stuff about Alfred Jacob Miller, if you'd like to learn more about him. My purpose here isn't to disparage Alfred Jacob Miller in any way, shape, or form. He is an invaluable asset to those of us who study fur trade history, and especially the history of the mountain men. But there are certain failings that, being the only book in town, the only game in town, certain problems that presents. One of them is a scarcity problem. If you only have, needless to say, if you only have one book that you can go to, you're going to not have the same information as if you had 1,000 books that you could go to. So that's one of the problems that we run into, having Alfred Jacob Miller as our only source. The next problem is an authority problem. It's not that Alfred Jacob Miller isn't a great authority, but to only have one person you can talk to about any certain situation. You can imagine if you were a police detective, for example, and one witness saw something versus 15 witnesses saw something, how much more information you would have from those 15 witnesses instead of just one witness. So it's a little bit of an authority problem in that we put a lot of weight on Alfred Jacob Miller. In fact, I've often thought if I were in Alfred Jacob Miller's shoes, I would be a little bit nervous that everyone was looking at my work and going over it with a fine-tooth comb on a daily basis. The third issue is an absence problem, which just means that Alfred Jacob Miller, even though he saw a lot of mountain man life, he didn't see all of mountain man life. Again, from April through October-ish, there's a lot that he would have seen, but he was never in a winter camp, for example. There were even times where he explained how trappers would trap beaver, and you could tell from his explanation that he hadn't seen it a whole lot. He had seen it a little bit, but there are little mistakes that he would make in his descriptions of how mountain men would trap beaver. So there are just certain things that he wasn't able to see because of his time in the mountains. So that's the absence problem. And there my background finally shows up. So again, my purpose isn't to disparage him in any way, but just so that we're familiar with some of the problems that brings up. So that brings up another question for us. Okay, what are we to do then as researchers who want to have more visual information, who want to know more about Alfred Jacob Miller? By the way, these images that you can see are famous Alfred Jacob Miller paintings that I adjusted, and I almost felt a little sacrilegious doing so, but anyway, so that brings up another question for us. What are we to do where we only have one resource that we can go to? My proposition here, and it's not, I'm certainly not the first person to propose this, but there are a lot of other contemporary artists who painted other things surrounding the fur trade. None of them ever came to a rendezvous. So none of them were at a Rocky Mountain rendezvous, and none of them, were in the Green River Valley, for example, during that period. But quite a few of them were contemporaries of Alfred Jacob Miller. Quite a few of them showed other aspects of the fur trade. Some of them were artists who were active after 1840. Normally we give a cutoff to 1840 to the last rendezvous. Some of these artists actually worked after 1840, but they were working, sometimes they had knowledge from pre-1840, etc. As you can imagine, each different artist, the situation would be slightly different. So, but that's basically what my article in the journal this year is about, is being able to look at other artists besides Alfred Jacob Miller to see what kind of information we can glean from those artists. Because they weren't at a rendezvous, obviously they present a problem as well. So let's talk about how are we going to solve that problem. One of the main ideas that I bring up in the article is the concept of triangulation. And what I mean by that is we're going to, because they weren't at a rendezvous, when we look at their paintings, their works, we're going to not depend on just what we see there. We're actually going to depend on other things. Typically speaking, for us as historical researchers, there are three main things that we look at. We'll look at original documents that are teaching us things about, you know, ledger pages, journals, that kind of stuff. We'll depend a lot on original documents. We'll depend a lot on images if we can find images that show what those documents are talking about. And the third thing we'll depend upon is what we call extant artifacts, or in other words, still existing artifacts that we can find in museums. Quite often, you know, you'll only have one thing. You'll have a ledger that will talk about one thing, and that's the only reference you have for a particular thing. If you can find something where there's a ledger you know, a ledger page or a journal page, and you can find an actual article that they're talking about, then you feel like you're pretty lucky. If you find all three, if you find a ledger page and you find an actual old article, and then you see that article pictured from that era, then you feel like you've hit a jackpot to some degree. So we rely on a lot of those things. A lot of times in those triangulations, you can't find all three things. In other words, you might find something talked about in two written places, and then maybe one extant article. So you don't always get the benefit of having all three of these things. But personally, when I'm looking for research, I try to find at least three things for anything that I'm questioning. So that's what I mean by triangulation. So that means whenever I'm looking at these other artists' work, then I'm going to be looking at other things. I'm not going to just depend on that one picture that I'm looking at. I'm going to make sure that I back that up with other research. Here's an example of that. Let's see. So this is a quote by Joe Meek, who was one of the famous mountain men. Sometime during this winter, Meek and Legard, who had escaped from the Pawnees, made another expedition together, traveling 300 miles on snowshoes to the Bitterroot River. Again, I mentioned that Alfred Jacob Miller never saw a winter camp because he wasn't in the mountains during the winter. So he doesn't ever show any snowshoes in his paintings. So the question arises, okay, did mountain men have snowshoes? Rather than just assume that they had snowshoes, we find artifacts and research that shows that they did. Obviously, Joe Meek said that they had snowshoes. And here's another quote by Robert Campbell, who was another he was actually a famous fur trade company owner, etc. Anyway, he said, I had two half-breeds mountain Indians with me. We carried no tents for ourselves. At night, we shoveled off the snow with our snowshoes for the dog's tent. So apparently they were taking care of their dogs pretty well. But anyway, we have two written accounts of them using snowshoes. So now the question is, what did those snowshoes look like? Okay. We don't have any pictures of Alfred Jacob Miller showing snowshoes. It's hard to tell from snowshoes how old they actually are, whether, unless you had somehow, if you could say, okay, this pair of snowshoes belonged to Jim Bridger, for example, but we don't have any snowshoes that we know of that belonged to a famous mountain man. So now we have to start hunting for another reference. George Catlin was a painter who I'm sure many of you have heard the name. He was a contemporary of Alfred Jacob Miller, except he painted mostly Indians. Very few whites did George Catlin paint. But fortunately, George Catlin showed Indians with snowshoes at the same time that Alfred Jacob Miller would have been in the mountains. And not fortunately, the reason that I chose this particular image, Catlin shows more images with snowshoes, but this image shows some of the turned upright snowshoes, some of the round end snowshoes. They're actually snowshoes that have a flat end on them. And Catlin showed all kinds of those variations. So now we can take a pretty good guess and say, we know that mountain men had snowshoes, and we can guess that those three styles were probably pretty accurate. That's as close as we could get, you know, unless someone finds a pair of snowshoes that belong to Jim Bridger, et cetera. So anyway, that's just kind of an example of the kind of triangulation that I'm trying to do as I'm looking at these other images. I don't want to take too much of Tony's time because I want to listen to his thing. So I probably won't take a whole half hour. What time are we at? Okay, yeah. So briefly, I want to show you some of these other artists and introduce you to some of these other artists whose works that we look at. Our third question then is, who are some of these other artists that we can look at some of their work? Another question that we always have as presenters is it's hard to know how much of your article to actually, you know, shall I go into all of the nitty gritty of my article, or shall I leave a little bit to the imagination so that you can actually go out and read my article? So rather than follow my article exactly like I wrote it, I'm actually taking a couple of detours from that. When I first started writing the article, I initially wondered about, you know, should I maybe just do an article that focuses on each artist and shows, you know, 4 or 5 works of each artist. The problem with that is it takes a lot of money to buy all of those images that you need, and it creates a large article and that kind of stuff. So another question that I had, you know, shall I just write the article about items and then show, okay, these 4 or 5 different artists show those items, that kind of stuff. It was a little tricky about how to approach the article. So if you read it, you'll see that I kind of did a little bit of a smattering of both. But here's another example. Rufus Sage, another pretty famous mountain man who kept a journal. He said, one of these piratical pests, he was talking about a wolf, stole a fur cap from off my head while I was sleeping. And in the morning, after a diligent search, no trace of it could be found. So that brings up the question, A, did mountain men have fur caps? Yes, we can see from that they had fur caps. What did those fur caps look like? Most of us, when we think of mountain men fur caps, think of something like this, okay, or something like this. And so then we start looking and see if we can find either extant artifacts that show those or any kind of paintings that show that kind of a fur cap. If you do a whole lot of research or even a little research on mountain men, you won't run into many caps like that in artwork of the era. Here's an example of a bunch of different artists from that era. and what they showed when they showed fur caps. So again, this is another just example of triangulation. Rather than relying on one source, we're going to rely on as many sources as we can possibly find that show what their fur caps would have looked like. I'm just going to really quickly talk about some of these artists, just so that you'll kind of be introduced to them a little bit. Joseph Goldsboro Bruff was an artist. He was actually self-trained, and he was, if you notice the date, oops, sorry about that. If you notice the date over there, it says 1850. So he didn't come around until, 10 years after the end of the Rendezvous era. And so normally a person would look at that 1850 and you'd say, well, that's way too late. I can't trust any of this stuff. But the truth is, if we start looking at each item individually, I can find triangulated examples of almost everything he shows here. The pack saddles are the same, the saddles are the same, the tin pots are the same, the spurs are the same, etc. I know that from other examples that I've seen of that era. So even though this is an image from 1850, we can get a lot of pre-1840 information, especially because Bruff was so good at kind of doing detail. Carl Bodmer was another contemporary artist who was painting at the same time as Alfred Jacob Miller. Again, like Catlin, he mostly painted Indians, but every once in a while in his images, a white man will pop up, and so you can find out information from some of this here. This is a great example of what a mountain man may have looked like then. Is this supposed to be? You remember who this is supposed to be? Charbonneau? Yeah, a relatively famous mountain man there. This is actually a self-portrait of Bodmer and his employer, Maximilian. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Charlie Russell. Charlie Russell was a hero of mine. I grew up, I don't think I ever didn't know who Charlie Russell was, because my dad was a Charlie Russell fan. When I first became interested in the fur trade, I started looking at Russell images, and everyone told me, you can't trust Russell. Russell wasn't around until the 1880s. So they said, you can't trust Charlie Russell's work because he was way too late. As I studied his work more and more, I realized, and Charlie Russell considered himself an illustrator. I was an illustrator in New York for quite a few years, and it wasn't uncommon for me as an illustrator to paint a scene from 1840 one week, and a scene from 1940 the next week, and a scene from 2000 the next week. I was constantly jumping around between time periods. And the more I studied Charlie Russell, I think he was in the same situation. When he wanted to do something that was pre-1840 or of that era, then he knew what he was doing as far as doing that. When he included something like, for example, this Yellow Boy rifle, that didn't come around until the 1860s. So he knew very well that he was painting the 1860s right there. He wasn't trying to fool anybody that he was painting something from 1840. But when he was painting earlier stuff, then all of his, I won't say all of it, but the vast majority of his stuff, especially considering the knowledge that was around in 1880, is pretty correct. Oh, sorry, I went backwards. This is a great image of his that there are very, very few details that you would find in this particular painting that would be post 1840. The same, this is a Kit Carson. The only big question that we have about in this particular painting is those botas that Charlie Russell often showed, and then the blankets that he often showed. I addressed those in my article. I'm not going to dive into them right now because it would take too much time, but if you read my article, you can see a little bit about what I said there. This is a guy named Arthur Fitzwilliam Tate. He was also after Miller, more in the 1850s. And so when you look at his things, every item that you look at You just have to back it up. There's a lot of these things that you will see on Miller's paintings. Most of the stuff you see in Miller's paintings, and you can triangulate and back up some of those things. Paul Kane was up in Canada, although he did, I think Kane made it all the way to Fort Vancouver. But he shows a lot of winter gear that Miller didn't show. And so he's a great resource to look at. Again, once again, any item that you look at, any single item, like you might look at those leggings or that capote and see if you can triangulate that information. Peter Rindesbacher was another guy in the Red River, Canada area. There's a couple of things that he shows, like those caps right there. You'll never see one of those caps in Alfred Jacob Miller's paintings, but they were actually quite ubiquitous in the fur trade. This guy's name is George Caleb Bingham. He was actually just out in the Mississippi River and Missouri River, kind of St. Louis area. But one of the things that I really like about his work, he would have been a contemporary of Alfred Jacob Miller. But Miller's work is quite, I wouldn't necessarily call it impressionistic, but it's not as detailed as some artists. Bingham's work is pretty detailed. You can especially see even just the cut of clothing really well on Bingham's work. So anyway, that's one of the things I like about his work. I don't want to take a whole lot more time. Again, I want to listen to Tony, but this was just a little bit of an introduction to some of those artists that you'll run across in my article if you read it, and kind of what a little bit about a dive into what the article is about. And so I invite you to get a copy of the journal and dive in a little deeper. It's always fascinating stuff to learn. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
We'll take a couple of quick questions while we're setting up for Tony, if anybody has one. Yes, David.
There's a lot of white horses show up in his painting. Why?
That's a great question. I have never found. I grew up on a little horse ranch, and so I'm sure as you, David, have done tons of research on horses. To my knowledge, we don't see a whole lot of difference in horse colors today than they saw back then. I've seen just about every color combination you can possibly imagine referred to back then, as well as images that from the era. Generally speaking, the horses were smaller, especially the mountain men's horses were smaller. I'll be perfectly honest and tell you my opinion of white horses. As an artist, I'm constantly thinking about my focal point. And the focal point is located wherever your highest, what's called value contrast happens. Wherever your lightest color and your darkest color is together is where the viewer's eye is going to go first. Personally, I do dark horses and light horses for that reason. My focal point is going to be the darkest or the lightest horse. And I, because they were professionally trained, a lot of them, I think that's part of the reason. But I'm pretty sure that William Drummond Stewart rode a white horse. So
Well, I was going to go to that because he's on a white or gray horse in
Yes.
every painting,
Yep.
isn't he? And you go right to it in
Yep.
every painting, don't you?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? Done. Thank you, Tim.
You betcha.
Sure.
That's next slide, previous slide. That working? Yeah. Looks like it's going slow because you have transitions.
Yes.
Okay, so just give it time when you click it.
And that's the pointer?
the pointer. Yep.
Our next speaker is Tony Hune. He was born and raised in Indiana, and many summers were spent traveling in Western United States, where he was captivated by its history. Hune worked 6 summers in Yellowstone National Park during his college years, which ignited his interest in Yellowstone and fur trade history. After graduating from Purdue University, he moved out west, eventually landing in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he has lived for 34 years. The title of his paper is The Vindication of Jim Bridger and His Tales of the Yellowstone. Tony Hune.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. The reason that I wrote this article was I've always had a fascination with Yellowstone history and Jim Bridger history. And I've never seen a study that really tied it together about when he was out there in the parks, who he influenced, who he told about the parks. And that's what I wanted to do with my article. So to start out, I wanted to start with a little fun image. If this thing will turn. This is an image that's down in Fort Bridger. They have in one of their display cases, back in 1993, the Lyman Police Department actually took one of the photographs of Jim Bridger and regressed it to what he might have looked like a young man. Unfortunately, this is taken through a glass showcase and there's a glare on it. But just for fun, I thought I'd see what I could do with AI, whether I could clean it up. So this might be a pretty good approximation of what Jim Bridger looked like as a young man. So the first part of my article, I really wanted to dive into when was Jim Bridger there. That really interested me. I found 7 instances of accounts of Jim Bridger being there by historians or by people that were there, or in groups that we know that he was with that group, and that therefore when that group traveled through Yellowstone, we knew Bridger was with them. I don't have time to go over those. I only have a half hour to talk to you. Please read the article. I go into depth on all 7 of those. Some of them are more reliable sources than others. But the one source I do want to go over that mentions Jim Bridger by name, that he definitely was there in Yellowstone, was done by a man named Osborne Russell. As many of you know, Russell's one of the very, very few fur trappers who kept a journal of his time out there. He had visited Yellowstone several times. In 1836, he actually joined Jim Bridger's brigade, and here at the rendezvous in Green River, Jim Bridger sent him out ahead to Yellowstone just before he was. And this is the route that they took up. And you can see down here at the rendezvous, and he came up Green River, over the Gros Ventre River into Jackson Hole. From there, he went up to Pacific Creek over Two Ocean Pass. This was a very famous pass that the mountain men used to get into the upper Yellowstone River, which flowed into Yellowstone Lake. They after camping up here on the north side of the lake, they actually went up where today Pelican Valley is, over into the Lamar Valley. This secluded valley is in the Lamar Valley. That was Osborne Russell's favorite place in Yellowstone. He describes it many times when he came through there. From there, they forded the Yellowstone River, came over here. This is the Gardner River up by Mammoth Hot Springs. And from there, they went out of the park. So I'm going to read a couple excerpts that Osborne Russell wrote. He goes, I started with a party of 15 trappers and 2 camp keepers ordered by Mr. Bridger to proceed to Yellowstone Lake and there await his arrival with the remainder of the party. On August 16th, Mr. Bridger came up with the remainder of the party. On the 18th, the whole camp moved down the east shore of Yellowstone Lake through thick pines and fallen timbers, about 18 miles, and encamped on a small prairie. On the 19th, we continued down the shore to the outlet, about 20 miles, and encamped in a beautiful plain which extends along the northern extremity of the lake. Near where we camped were several hot springs, which boil perpetually. Near these was an opening in the ground about 8 inches in diameter, of which hot steam issues continuously with a noise similar to that made by the steam issuing from a safety valve of an engine can be heard for 5 or 6 miles distant. I should think the steam issued with sufficient force to work an engine of 30 horsepower. So the feature he's describing is Steamboat Point, which is still there today. Unfortunately, it doesn't steam. The steam is not that as active as it was back then, which is not uncommon with the thermal features of Yellowstone. But it's really neat to think that Jim Bridger and Osborne Russell knew of this place. And I spent many afternoons on that rock down there fishing. So the second part of my article that I want to kind of go into is who he told about out there. The very first person that we have a written account that Jim Bridger talked to was a man named Lieutenant John Gunnison. Now, Gunnison was on an expedition with Captain Howard Stansbury. And in 1849, they stopped at Fort Bridger, where Jim Bridger was, and they hired him as a guide to take him to Salt Lake City. After he led him there, Bridger came back to his fort. And the following spring in 1850, Stansbury came back through with Gunnison, and they hired Bridger again. This time, Bridger led him across southern Wyoming on a new route going east. Instead of following up through South Pass, he took a southern route that kind of parallels with the Transcontinental Railroad and part of I-80 currently goes today. It was on this section that Gunnison actually wrote about Jim Bridger telling him about the wonders of Yellowstone. A few years ago, I actually found this pamphlet, which actually has a quote of that direct Jim Bridger description of what he said about Yellowstone. And he says, a lake 60 miles long, cold and placid, lies embosomed among high precipitous mountains. Geysers spout up 70 feet high with a terrific hissing noise. At regular intervals, waterfalls are sparkling, leaping, and thundering down precipices and collecting the pool below. The river issues from this lake and for 15 miles roars through the perpendicular canyon at its outlet. The next person that Jim Bridger told and was Father Pierre Jean de Schmidt. I noticed after I did this, I titled his name backwards. So de Schmidt was a Catholic missionary that came here actually at the last rendezvous, as many of you have been out to the Schmidt Monument. De Schmidt went out among the Indians, established some missions, and was very well liked and well known by the Indians. He was also a big map maker, and he loved to sketch maps. And if he hadn't been there, he would get information from people. Now, de Schmidt had never been to Yellowstone before, so we know when he made this sketch, this is information that he got discussing Jim Bridger. So it looks like a lot of chicken scratching when you first look at it, but if you actually look at it, there's some really neat details. This here is the Yellowstone River. This here is Yellowstone Lake, and he's got the word 60, and I can't quite make out the other letters. That 60 miles is how long he described to Gunnison how long Yellowstone Lake was. Over here, he's got a hot springs. Up here, he's got a great volcano. I'm pretty sure he's talking about the Mud Volcano area just north of Yellowstone Lake. It used to be much more active. When the first explorers came there, they actually described seeing it from miles around. Right now, you go up there, it doesn't erupt anymore, but I'm pretty sure that's what they're referring to there. Right here, he's got falls, says 240 feet. Now there's 3 falls along the Yellowstone River, 2 of them in the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, the upper falls and the lower falls. The upper falls is only about 110 feet. The lower falls is about 300. So my guess is he's describing the lower falls of the Yellowstone River are there. There's also Tower Falls, which is further north, but it's only about 130 feet. If you also look here, he's kind of got a squiggly line around here. And I'm guessing that designates the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. A little further up, this is the Lamar Valley, the Lamar River coming in. And way over here, we've got the Gardner River, and he's got Gardner's Hole, and he's got a little notation of a place called Sulphur Mountain. That's currently what we know as Mammoth Hot Springs today. He's also got over here, this is the Gallatin River, this is the Madison, and at the head of the Madison River is where the Firehole River is. He's got written volcanic country. And of course, that's where Old Faithful and the majority of Yellowstone's geysers are in this basin right here. So with this sketch, de Schmidt made this map, and this is actually the treaty map that showed all the land that was agreed to in this 1851 treaty that he was actually invited to come to. So because of the recent immigration on the Oregon Trail, there were a lot of Indian conflicts. And so in 1851, they had a big Indian council, and Schmidt was in charge of making the map for this council. Jim Bridger was over there with him. So Schmidt actually writes here, during the 10 years that he spent in Indian country, I occupied myself occasionally in drawing maps of the countries through which I passed. I think that the most extraordinary spot in this respect, and perhaps the most marvelous of all the northern half of this continent, is in the very heart of the Rocky Mountains. That is between the sources of the Madison and the Yellowstone. He continues on, I have this report from Captain Bridger, who is familiar with every one of these mounds, having passed 30 years of life among them. So although he had never visited the Yellowstone country, Jim Bridger is the one that he got this information from. So on this map, if you look right, whoa. Try to go back to there. The dividing line between Blackfoot territory and Crow territory is the Yellowstone River, which is right in here. And right down here is Yellowstone Lake. Now, it's really hard to see that detail. I got this from the Library of Congress site, and luckily, they have a tracing and a blow up of that map. And this is that detail from that last map that you saw. And we can see a lot of the detail that Schmidt made from his original hand sketching he transferred over onto here. Right in here is Yellowstone Lake, and he's got written 60 miles right on it. Over here, he's got the volcano that was noted on his map. If you come up the Yellowstone River here, he's got Little Falls, which is a little perplexing because on his other map, it said 245 feet, which would be the big falls. So maybe he wasn't referring to the lower falls of Yellowstone. Maybe it was Tower Falls. We don't know. A little further up, here's the Gardner River, and here's Sulphur Mountain again. That's Mammoth Hot Springs up there. Coming over here, we've got, this is the Firehole Basin area. He's got great volcanic and constant eruption. So he's not afraid to put hot springs and stuff on his map here too. Another interesting little feature, way over here, this is over by Cody, Wyoming. The Stinking River is the Shoshone River that goes in the Bighorn. He's clearly got Coulter's Hell listed there. There's been a lot of confusion and people over the years speculating that Coulter's Hell referred to Yellowstone Park. And this is another piece of evidence that points that is actually these hot springs that are over in Cody, which are right now below the Buffalo Bill Dam. They're not there anymore. And this today is what they called Sulphur Mountain, today's Mammoth Hot Springs. So the next important person that Jim Bridger told about Yellowstone was a man named Governor K. Warren. So in the summer of 1856, Warren, who was a lieutenant in the Corps of Topographical Engineers, he led an expedition to map the upper Missouri River and the lower Yellowstone River. On this expedition, he had two scientists with him, Ferdinand Hayden, and Hayden's assistant, a man named James Stevenson. All three of these men got to know Jim Bridger very well on this expedition. Bridger told them extensively about the Yellowstone area. So much so that Warren wanted to come back on a second expedition and explore this, so he planned one. In fact, Warren writes, he's been fortunate in meeting with Mr. James Bridger and others that are acquainted with the character of this country. He's talking about the Yellowstone country, and have the assurances of services of Mr. Bridger if an exploration would be ordered. So when he got back, they planned a second expedition. Unfortunately, because of personal situation, Warren was not able to lead this, but a man named William Reynolds did take over the leadership. Once again, Ferdinand Hayden went as his assistant along with James Stevenson, and Jim Bridger was hired as their guide. So for the very first time, Jim Bridger was going to lead a group of men into Yellowstone Park to prove once and for all these tales that he's telling about these fantastic geysers and waterfalls are really there. So Reynolds actually leaves in 1859. He's actually comes up the Missouri River and leaves Fort Pierre. And this is his route. He takes overland, comes over to Fort Sarpy, which is where the Bighorn River comes into the Yellowstone. He then comes down by Lake Schmidt, which is near Sheridan, Wyoming, comes down just goes past where Casper is today, and he winters in a spot called Deer Creek Station. In the spring of 1860 is when they're going to finally go into Yellowstone Park. He decides he's going to split his command into two parties. The first one is he has a Captain Maynadier, and his route here is in the blue, and he's going to actually come up here through the Bighorn Valley. Cody, Wyoming is right over here, and explore this and come up to the Three Forks area. Meanwhile, Reynolds is going to take a group and come up the Wind River and hopefully get over Togety Pass, up over into the Two Ocean Plateau area, coming down into Yellowstone Lake, and then eventually meeting a Maynadier up at Three Forks. So in addition to exploring this new area, they had a second mission for this whole exhibition, and they wanted to observe a total eclipse that could only be observed up in Canada. So they had a certain date, they had to be up about 100 miles north of the border. So he was on a time crunch. So he left early. And when he left, Jim Bridger told him, there's no way you're going to get over these mountains into the upper Yellowstone River. And sure enough, when they got up to Togety Pass, they ran into sheer cliffs and tons of snow. And Jim Bridger is even quoted as saying, even a bird can't make it across these mountains without taking a day's worth of food. And sure enough, they had to back up. So they actually went up the Wind River, and Bridger led them over Union Pass into Jackson Hole. This is actually the very first government-sponsored expedition to ever be in Jackson Hole. They actually went over the Snake River, over Teton Pass, up the Idaho side, came up north here, north of Henry's Lake, right in here. There's actually a pass called Reynolds Pass, named after Captain Reynolds. And they made it up to Three Forks. The reason they didn't come into Yellowstone from the Madison River drainages is because they were on this time crunch. He desperately wanted to get up to observe this eclipse. When he gets to Three Forks, unfortunately, Maynadier is not there, and he has to wait. And so the delays of him coming, and when they finally did meet together, they gave up even of going up to Canada. So he ended up going up here to Fort Benton and coming back east. So unfortunately, he failed on both his missions to explore the Yellowstone country and to observe the solar eclipse. But what did result was a map. Now, when he got back to the States, this was back in 1860, the Civil War happened the next year. And unfortunately, his official report and this map did not come out until 1868, well after the Civil War. So it was really of no use to other explorers at the time. If you look at it, he's got a lot of detail where Maynadier came up through here and he came through this route. He's got a lot of detail through there. We got this big vacant area in the middle of where Yellowstone Park is today. But there are a few features there that he did get. And he actually wanted Jim Bridger to come back east and help him with this map. We have a letter from Robert Campbell's brother, Hugh Campbell, writing back saying that Jim Bridger would be glad to come as long as you could pay his expenses. But I'm guessing because of the Civil War and Reynolds being redirected to other projects, that never happened. So the map that he did make is very sparse in details, but he's got Yellowstone Lake here. And when you come up here, he's got a new feature called Elephant Back Mountain right here. And that's right next to where the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone is. If you're familiar with Yellowstone, like I am, that's Mount Washburn. Today, there is a Elephant Back Mountain in Yellowstone Park, but it's actually down on Yellowstone Lake. It's a different ridge. When the Washburn expedition came through years later, they named it after their leader, not realizing it had this prior name that was well known by the mountain men called Elephant's Back. So when Hayden came through, he transferred that name that he knew of because of this expedition to this other ridge today. That's something I found out when I was doing my research that I didn't know, despite all those years of working in Yellowstone. So, then also, there's Elephant Back Mountain today, which is what we know as Mount Washburn. And if you look at it, it does resemble more humpback of elephants than the ridge that's named today after that. So the next important person that he ran into was a man named Nathaniel P. Langford. And Langford wrote, I first became acquainted with Bridger in the year of 1866. He told me in Virginia City, Montana at that time of the existence of Yellowstone and the Madison Rivers, and said he had seen a column of water as large as his body spout as high as a flagpole in Virginia City, which was about 60 feet high. So Langford believed him. He was very interested. And so he actually got a group of citizens from Montana, and they were going to form an expedition in 1869 to actually explore this for themselves. Unfortunately, because of some local Indian uprisings and the fact that they could not get a military escort to help them, that expedition got canceled. But 3 men of that expedition, named Charles Cook, David Folsom, and William Peterson, decided to go anyways. And just so 3 men alone with no escort went through the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yellowstone Lake, the Firehole River Valley, came back with this extravagant stories of what was there. Langford talked to these men, and he was convinced that it was definitely there. So in 1870, the very next year, Nathaniel Langford met a man named Jay Cook. He was raising money to build the second transcontinental railroad that would have gone from St. Paul, Minnesota, through southern Montana, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Cook knew about these rumors of these great wonders at the head of the Yellowstone, and knew that if these were true, it'd be a great tourist attraction for his railroad. So he hired Langford and gave him support to do an expedition in 1870. So in 1870, they had 9 people that went on this, along with 4 camp cooks and handlers, and they elected them, or they told them Henry Washburn was a man that was on here who was a former Civil War general, and he became the leader. Langford was the organizer. They made Washburn the leader. They also got a military escort, thanks to Jay Cook, a man named Doane. So a lot of times it's called the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition. These prominent men kept diaries and journals, including Langford. And they left from where Bozeman, Montana is. There was a little fort called Fort Ellis, and they traveled across Bozeman Pass, went up the Yellowstone River, and for themselves saw the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone for the very first time. They went further south to Yellowstone Lake, discovered that huge lake, and then they went over the divide west over into Old Faithful area. This is actually a drawing that Langford made for a magazine article he wrote showing his camp in the Upper Geyser Basin. And while he was here, Langford wrote the following: I forded the Firehole River a short distance below our camp. When I reached the middle of the stream, I discovered from the sensation of warmth under my feet that I was standing upon an incrustation formed over a hot spring that had its vent in the bed of the stream. I exclaimed, "Here's the river which Bridger said was hot on the bottom." Bridger had once told me that he had seen a river which flowed so rapidly over the smooth surface of descending rock ledge in the bottom of the stream that the water was hot at the bottom. My experience in crossing the Firehole River that day leads me to believe that Jim Bridger had at some time a similar experience. So when Langford got home, he went on a lecturing tour for Jay Cook on behalf of the railroad, and he went to Washington, D.C., where in January of 1871, he gave a lecture. And in attendance to that lecture was Ferdinand Hayden. Remember, Hayden and his assistant, James Stevenson, had both been on 2 expeditions with Jim Bridger, the Reynolds expedition in 1856, or no, the Warren expedition in 1856, Reynolds expedition in 1860. And he remembered how close he came to actually discovering these wonders on that 1860 expedition. And so he was very excited, and he knew the time was right to ask Congress for money to lead an expedition. And this time he got the money, and this time Hayden was the leader himself. So in 1871 with Stevenson, he left Fort Ellis up by Bozeman and took a very similar route that the Washburn-Langford expedition took the year before. They came down, saw Yellowstone Canyon for the first time. Here's a painting made years later by William Henry Jackson. Jackson was also on this expedition as a photographer So for the first time, people were taking photographs that they could see for themselves that these wonders were real. Another person on here was a very famous watercolor painter, Thomas Moran. So between these two, they had visual evidence of what these wonders that were out there. Here's another painting that Jackson did years later of that Hayden expedition over in the Firehole Basin. And for the very first time, Hayden saw what Jim Bridger had told him about. And it says here that geysers fascinated Hayden so much that he cannot compose himself in the presence of a geyser in eruption, but losing recollection of the material world for time, rubs his hands, shouts, and dances around the object of his admiration in a gleeful excitement. So that he was extremely excited that these wonders were really true. When he got done with this expedition, actually before he left, he actually named a very island out here, Stevenson Island, after his assistant James Stevenson. And Hayden Valley is actually named after Ferdinand Hayden himself. When they got back, along with Langford's help, both Langford and Hayden, both friends of Jim Bridger, worked with Congress, show them the pictures and the paintings that were made, and they worked pretty fast, and they set aside our country's very first national park, which Ulysses Grant signed on March 1st of 1872. So at this point, I want to share 3 images that we know of Jim Bridger. 2 of them are photographs and one's a painting. Almost every article you see has this picture on there. There was a copy in the Kansas City Public Library that written on the back, scribbled that this was taken for his sons in 1857. So this would have been right between that Warren and the Reynolds expedition, what he might have looked like. And just for fun, I wanted to see if I could clean this up with AI and colorize it. So we got a little more detail here of what Jim Bridger may have looked like at that time. So Jim Bridger, he returned east for good in 1868 to his farm near Westport, Missouri, just south of where Kansas City is. He spent the last 13 years of his life on his farm as he slowly lost his eyesight. It's very probable that he was told about the creation of Yellowstone National Park before his death. This is the other famous photograph that we believe was taken around 1866. This would have been just a couple years before he retired back to Kansas City for good. And of course, I had to play around with a little AI and see how that one popped out. Thought it came out kind of cool. Now, Jim Bridger had a very close friend, a man named Steuben Watts. He ran a grist mill on the neighboring property. And in 1939, Steuben's son, Edgar, recalled his memory of being a very young boy listening to his dad and Jim Bridger talk. So in this newspaper article, he writes, "Old Jim had a gift of language. I can remember him talking to father, telling about the way people all said he was a liar when he told them about seeing springs of boiling water in the Yellowstone. Why, Steubens, they said I was the damnedest liar ever lived. That's what a man gets for telling the truth." So this is the third image we know of Jim Bridger. So this is painted by a man named Henry Cross in 1879. This is just 2 years before Bridger passed away. Cross was very famous for his paintings of Native Americans that he met, along with other famous frontier people. And I had to play with AI on this one too. So I told it to generate a lifelike image from this painting, and this is what it came up with. So coincidentally, in 1879, when this painting was made, the editor of the Kansas City Journal had just seen a lecture about Yellowstone Park, which was created 7 years before. And it moved him to write an editorial in the Kansas City paper. And I want to read an excerpt from that. And he writes, "Everybody's heard of the old mountaineer Bridger, or Jim Bridger as he's familiarly called. And everybody about Kansas City and Westport 15 years ago knew him. And he's still alive today on his farm within a few miles of us. Bridger, up to the time of the Hayden survey, knew more of the country between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean than any white man or even red man living or dead. It was 23 years ago that we first met Bridger, who was at Kansas City outfitting for one of his expeditions to the mountains. We were intensely interested in his tales of adventure and his descriptions of scenery. He described to us this very Yellowstone country with its geysers, mud volcanoes, boiling hot springs, or as he said, there's a country up there on Yellowstone where the earth was on fire. He described with great minuteness of detail these wonders, not in a scientific way, but in a way a hunter or a mountaineer would naturally do. We made an arrangement with him to give us an hour or two someday that we might make notes and then write them up for the journal, which was cheerfully granted. The interview, as it's now called, took place in front of a commission house down on the levee. After the interview had ended, we noticed that one of the firm before whose door we were seated was making energetic beckoning gestures to us. And we went in and behind the desk to see what he wanted. He asked us what we're doing out there with old Jim. We replied that we're making notes of his story about the mountains and the things he'd seen. What are you going to do with your notes? Write them out, was my response. You don't intend to print them, do you? Yes, was my reply. Well, said our friend, if you do, everybody will make fun of you and run you out of town with ridicule. When we asked for the reason, we got this. Old Bridger's just poking fun at you, stuffing you as he does every new man who asks him questions. There's not a word of truth in all that story, and he's laughing in his sleeve right now. And now we didn't write up those notes. And for years thereafter, did the injustice to the old veteran of believing a man who had never seen the mountains in preference to the man who had passed a generation among their grandeur and solitudes. And we now take occasion to do justice to the veteran hunter and scout and add his name to the very few white men that had looked upon these marvels of Wonderland prior to the recent discovery less than 10 years ago. Bridger is vindicated at last. So on July 17th, 1881, 9 years after the creation of Yellowstone Park, James Felix Bridger died on his farm near Newport, Missouri. I found a newspaper article that described his original grave. What you see here is a new monument. In 1904, they transferred his body. And on that original grave, his family wrote these words about him. It says, "We miss thee in the circle around the fireside. We miss thee in devotion at quiet eventide. The memory of thy nature, so full of truth and love, shall lead our thoughts to seek thee among the best above." With that, I'd like to give special thanks Jim Hardy, and Jim Alden, Jerry Ensler. And with that, anybody got any questions?
Thanks, Tony. We have time for some questions if anyone has any.
Real quick question. Some of those early maps in your article,
Mhm.
That's excellent.
No, thanks.
Anyone else? All
Thought I
right.
was going to be grilled.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
That concludes our session. We'll have another one tomorrow afternoon and a couple of good articles there too. Hope you come to the presentation of the volume 20 tonight at 6:30 and then our Hall of Fame presentations at 7 o'clock. Until then, have a pleasant afternoon.